Hello my dear chess friends, welcome to the second chapter of my course, and in this chapter we're gonna take a look on the third move of white, f2, f3. So it's one of the possible moves, and here black has a couple of options, but in this course I suggest to play e7, e5. So for example, black can also transpose to the Pirt's defense or King's Indian defense by playing g6. Also, d5 can be a possibility, but it's rather dubious than playable. And c5 also can be played, but still it's not the best move in this position. So, after f3, e5, white has three possible continuations. So the main line will be d5. Also, quite popular continuation is taking on e5, and it leads to an endgame, which is more pleasant than a normal endgame with knight c3, third move, and after this d takes e5. And also there is a move knight e2, but after this black's position is quite fine, and yeah, that's not a big problem for us. So I would suggest to start with knight e2. Let's take a quick look on this move. So, and now our idea will be to strike in the center. So first we take the pawn, knight d4, and now we play d5. So we are not afraid of this push. If white takes on d5, then we can just even simply capture back, and our position should be already preferable, because f3 move in this case is weakening the king's position. So that's why e4, e5 should be played, knight h5. Now we are threatening to go with our queen on h4, so that's why white plays g3, and we play c5, kicking knight from the center. So the main move here is knight to b5, but also possible to play knight b3. In this case, we finish the development with knight c6, and if knight c3, then black has c4 move, and if knight d4, then bishop c5. And computer already likes this position for black. So after knight b5, we go d4, because if we play something else, let's say knight c6, then in this case white has nice trick, queen takes d5. And if we capture back, then it will be knight c7 check, king d8, and knight takes d5. And white is just much better, even though we pick up the pawn back, but still the position is dubious. Our king is in the center, also the knight on d5 is quite good, so we should not play it like this. So that's why instead of knight c6 we play d4, f4, g6, knight d2, a6, knight a3. And now we place our bishop on e7 and not on g7, because we need g7 square for our knight. Bishop g2 is the most logical continuation. Knight g7, knight c4, h5, short castle, knight c6, knight e4, and knight f5. And the position is approximately equal. So most probably we will try to put our bishop on e6, rook on c8, maybe short castle or king f8, king g7. White will try to play a4, stopping the pawn push on the queen side. So yeah, the position should be completely equal. Now I think we should take a look on the endgame. So after d, de, queen d8, king d8, there is only one move which makes sense for white, and it's bishop c4. So after this we do not play bishop e6. Here we play similar to the first chapter, so king e8, bishop e3 to prevent black from playing bishop c5, knight bd7. And here white has two options, so it's knight c3 and knight d2. After knight c3 we play c6, limiting this knight, e4, e5, we do not allow white to grab space with f5, knight h3, bishop c5, knight d1, bishop e3, knight e3, knight c5, knight f2, and king e7. So the position again is approximately equal, but the only idea that you need to keep in mind is that we do not rush with the trade of light squared bishops, because in this case the knight is getting a nice square on c4 and our pawn is getting weak, and also b6 square is getting weak. So our idea will be, let's say after king e2, to play rook d8 and something like g6, knight fd7, knight b6, and after this we will see what should we do. So also instead of knight c3, I mentioned knight d2 move. After this we go bishop c5, knight f1, bishop e3, knight e3, again we go a5, and white has a lot of options. So for example, can play knight h3, go knight c5, threatening to take the knight. So knight f2 and c6, and again the position should be completely equal. So I think that's all what you should know about the endgame. It's not a big problem for us, but also white can play d5, which is the most ambitious move here. And now the position looks very similar to the King's Indian defense. And here, after d5, I suggest to play first bishop e7, finishing the development. And in general, in this position, it would be great for black to trade dark squared bishops. And in this case, all dark squares will get weak for white, and we will get rid of our bad bishop, so it should be completely fine. And in this position, white has three moves which make sense. So first one is c4, the second is bishop e3, and I think the most flexible for white is to play knight e2 here. So, for example, I think we should start with the c4 move. In this case, things for us are much easier than in other lines. So, after this, we play knight d7. Our idea is to play bishop g5 next. That's why white plays bishop e3 to meet bishop g5 move with bishop f2. Now we play a5 to grab the control over dark squares. Knight c3, knight e6, bishop d3. That's quite a natural diagonal for the bishop in King's Indian. I mean b1 h7 diagonal. So, and also the point of placing the bishop like this is to fight for the light squares in case of f7, f5, because white will take on f5, we will capture back with the bishop, and white will manage to trade the bad light squared bishop and will get control over e4 square. But still, it will be our main idea in this line. So for example, after bishop d3, we go knight dc5, bishop c2 is the most logical, short castle, knight ge2, f5, he takes f5, and bishop takes f5 is also possible here, but much stronger is bishop g5. And here white has three options. The first one is to capture on c5, the second one is to move bishop on f2, and the third one is to take the bishop on g5. So let's start with bishop takes g5. In this case, we take with the queen. And for example, if white is trying to keep the pawn, then we go knight b4, bishop b1, and bishop f5 is quite strong move. And for example, if bishop f5, then rook f5, and our position is already slightly better. But if white decides to capture on f5, then we just take on g2, and our position is completely winning. So let's move to the bishop f2 move. In this case, we just grab the pawn on f5, bishop f5, rook f5, knight g3, rook f8, knight e4, knight e4, knight e4, b6, short castle, and knight b8 is the best here. So knight c5 is a sort of positional mistake, because in this case we allow white to trade the dark squared bishop and to get a stable advantage because of the knight on e4. So it's very similar to the French defense when white is getting the strong knight on d4 against the bad light squared bishop of black. So yeah, we should avoid this. And if you don't play knight c5, then our knight on a6 is not useful, is simply misplaced. That's why it makes sense to regroup it. So knight b8, after this knight d7, and at some point we'll try to trade knights. And this position should be around equality. So also, one of the possibilities for white in this position is to capture on c5. And in this case, we capture back. And white has, again, two options. To play knight g3 or to push g4. So let's take on knight g3 move. In this case, we pin the knight with the intention to take it and to take on f5. Knight e4, bishop f5, knight c5, dc, bishop f5, rook f5, short castle, bishop g3, hg, queen g5, queen c2, rook f6, queen f2, e4, or queen g4, rook e1, rook e8, b3, b6. So this position again is around equality, so we have sort of weakness on e4, but in the same time white has a weakness on g3. Also the h file is opened. It can become really dangerous for white. So, but as I said, objectively the evaluation is equality. So instead of knight g3, white can also play g4. And here we need to keep in mind quite a nice idea to open up the position, and it's g6. So, and for example, white can play knight g3, and here we go bishop f4. So if white castle short side, then we capture the knight on g3, hg, g takes f5, and the position should be equal. So we managed to get the pawn back. Why we should be worse, yeah? So in case of queen e2 here, then in this case we do not capture on g3, because now we are just lost in this position, and white will castle alongside, and our king is in big trouble. So that's why after queen e2 we play queen h4, and if queen f2, then queen h3, preventing white from castling, and this position is with a huge compensation for black. So black has a control over dark squares. Also, it's not that clear for white what to do with the king. So quite nice position. And now we can move to the fifth move of white, bishop e3. So the point of this move is to keep the position flexible and to see what black is going to do, because sometimes white is not even playing c4, but might play knight c3 and queen d2. So you could check it yourself to find out in which positions. My goal here in this course just to give away how you should play it, yeah, and not how you shouldn't. So after bishop e3 there will be a different idea, and here we will try to sabotage the center by playing c6. So we already want to take on d5, that's why white plays c4, and now we play b5. So and again in this position white has 4 options. So the first one is to grab the pawn on b5, the second one is to grab the pawn on c6, the third option is to play a3 with the idea to play knight c3, and the fourth one is to play knight e2. So let's start with the c takes b5. It's the most principal move, but not the strongest. So cd, ed, bishop b7, bishop c4, knight bd7, knight c3, knight b6. So, and in one of the games between club players with ratings approximately around 1700, white played bishop b3, and here black didn't use the chance to equalize and probably even playing for initiative. So here the strongest is to play a6 to open up the a file for the rook, and if in case of b takes a6 to capture back with the rook, and next play queen a8. But the problem is that in the game was played short castle, and it's a bad move because white could get a big advantage by playing a4, and now a6 idea is not more relevant, as in this case white will play a5, kicking back the knight from b6 and next b6. So, and this position is just already very bad. So after knight b6 there is also a move bishop b6, but it's rather computer idea because it's not simple decision for human to give up a dark squared bishop which covers all dark squares, and especially when white played f2, f3, it looks really dubious. But okay, if computer recommends it, we need to check it. And in this case we capture back with the queen, a4, rook c8, and white can play, for example, b3 or bishop b3. Then in case of bishop b3 we play e5, fixing dark squares and also preventing white from playing a4, a5. And here we have a huge compensation. If b3, then again we should play a5, otherwise, for example, in case of the castle, then will be a5 and white again is much better. So a5, ba, bishop takes a6, bishop takes a6, queen takes a6, knight e2, and queen a7, preventing white from castling, and I believe that only white can be in trouble in this position. We have quite a nice compensation for the sacrificed pawn. So let's move back to this position and let's take a look on d takes e6. So this move was played in the game between Swiss grandmasters Gallagher and Pelletier in 2012, and here the game went with b takes e4, queen a4, queen c7, bishop c4, knight c6, knight c3, bishop d7, rook c1, knight d4, knight b5 was played, and in the game black didn't use the chance to get a big advantage, and they just decided to trade everything, which was a mistake. And in this position black has a very small plus because black has a center, and the king probably will be a little bit more active, but white played quite a nice game and in the end managed to make a draw. But let's move back to this moment when knight b5 was played, and here the strongest was to play queen b8. So the idea is quite clear, we are gonna win the knight on b5. So that's why white should capture ed. Now we are threatening to play a6 next, queen b3, d5, ed, bishop c5, bishop knight e2, queen b6, bishop d3 to prepare castle, otherwise would be d3 check. Castle, castle, and rook c8. And computer just says that this position is absolutely winning for black, around -2. And the point is that all dark squares are weak, d5 pawn is going to fall one day, and yeah. So d takes e6 is not a big threat for us. We should be rather happy if we see this move. So, and white can also play a3. It was played in the game between Lupulescu and Kempinski during Bundesliga in 2016. And the idea, as I said before, is to prepare knight c3 move. So here we should just castle, knight c3, b takes c4, bishop c4, and here in the game was played bishop b7, but it's a slight inaccuracy, and I think white could get a small plus in this game. But I'm still gonna show you this game because it shows how black can potentially equalize. So after short castle, now we can play d5, ed, knight d5, bishop f2, bishop g5, knight d5, bishop d5, knight c3, bishop a2, rook a2, queen c7, queen e2, rook d8, knight e4, bishop e7, b4, and here the draw was agreed. But after bishop c4, I believe that the strongest for black is to take the pawn on d5. And here we are not blundering the rook on e8. I mean that after bishop d5 we can capture, and in case of queen d5 we have queen d7. And if queen a8 will be played, then knight c6 followed by bishop b7, we gain the queen back and we are just better. So instead of bishop d5 makes sense for white to take with the knight, but in this case we develop our bishop on e6, knight e2, knight bd7, knight c3, knight d5, bishop d5, rook b8, rook b1, knight b6, short castle, and queen d7. So we have quite good counter chances because we have pressure on the b file. Also we can develop our rook on c8, so that's quite a nice position to play. So let's move back, and here probably the strongest is to play knight e2. The idea is sort of similar to a3 move, because white is going to place the knight on c3, but this move is much more useful than a3. So for example, after b takes c4, we do not play knight bc3, but white plays instead knight ec3. And the second knight will try to take the pawn on c4 and organize the pressure, let's say, on the pawn d6. In this case, we play bishop b7, bishop c4, knight bd7, dc, bishop takes c6, bishop b3, looks like the most precise move. And here, black should play a5 first, short castle, knight b6. We are preparing a4 move. So, for example, king h1. Now e4 doesn't make sense because after bishop b6 we don't have an important check, and white will just capture the pawn on a4. So we just simply castle, knight a3. Now we play a4, knight c4, knight c4, bishop c4, queen a8, queen d3, and rook c8. So the position looks similar to neither of Sicilian. White has the control over d5. We have open files. Also, our pieces have good dynamical potential. So that's why the position is around equality. And instead of bishop e3, white can also play knight e2 move, which is probably the strongest. And the idea of this move is, again, to keep the position flexible and also to avoid the idea of playing c6 and b5. So, for example, if you play c6 here, in this case, for example, will be c4, and b5 is already a mistake, because after cb, ed, bishop b7, white plays knight c3, and we cannot get a good compensation for the sacrificed pawn compared to one of the lines we have checked before. So, after after knight e2, I suggest short castle, and if bishop e3, now again our plan will be a little bit different. So we just develop our knight on a6. From this square it might go on c5 at some point. It depends on some circumstances. And for example, here white can choose between queen d2 and c4. Queen d2 is the idea is to keep the position flexible. Let's take a look on this. And after knight c5, if b4, then now we can take on e4, fe, knight e4, queen d3, knight f6 back, knight bc3, c6, g3, cd, knight d5, queen d5, bishop e6, followed by d5, and we are getting quite strong initiative for the sacrificed knight. So that's why b4 is not an option for white. Also can be played c4, but here I suggest h6 move. And next we are going to play knight h7, bishop g5. So one of the ideas I mentioned before. So it's useful to trade the dark squared bishop in this position. For example, the game might continue with knight c3, knight h7, bishop f2, e5, queen c2 to prepare long castle, because otherwise if long castle then will bishop g5 and white has to play bishop e3 for trading queens. So that's why queen c2, e4, grabbing space, long castle a3, b4, knight a6, b5 can be played. That's just a computer idea, but from the human point of view, it's a little bit strange looking, as white is losing a chance to organize something on the queen side in the long term, and now the position is just getting sort of closed, and I don't see how white could make serious progress on the king's side, but in the same time we have some counterplay on the queen side, so probably connected with e6. So also instead of c4 and b4 moves, white can go in knight bc3, but then c6, long castle, cd, ed, queen a5, a3, b5, and knight e2. So a bit surprising idea, but white is trying to say that the endgame will be slightly better because of the control over c6 square, so the knight will come to c6, but the endgame is objectively just equal. So we are playing h5 to prevent g4, and after bishop e2, bishop f5, we have quite nice counter chances here. So after knight e6, the main move is c4. Now we develop our bishop. For example, can be played knight bc3, c6, queen d2, cd, cd, and here quite a nice idea is to play h5. So we are stopping g4, and also in the next couple of moves we're gonna move our knight back to h7 and prepare f5, getting quite a nice chances to overtake the initiative. And the game might continue with knight c1. White has to develop the king side somehow. Knight h7, bishop a6, b takes a6, short castle, f5, e takes f5, and bishop takes f5 with quite nice position. So instead of knight bc3, also possible knight ec3. In this case, we go knight h5, knight d2, bishop g5, bishop f2, bishop h6, just to move back the bishop to avoid h4 g4 motif. And if g4, then now knight f4, h4 g6, and the position should be around equality. So we have quite a nice knight on the 4. Also, we have potential on the both sides of the board in the long term, and it's not that clear how white could try to improve the position. So guys, thank you for watching this chapter, and I'm waiting for you in the next third chapter.